In this video, I'll show you two examples of a utilitarian case study. The idea behind utilitarianism is that when you're faced with several options, the morally correct choice is whichever one will lead to the greatest utility. That's the greatest pleasure or the least suffering for the greatest number of people. To figure out what leads to the greatest utility, you have to look at several aspects of the situation. First, you have to look at how intense the pleasure will be. For example, when you're trying to decide whether you should eat healthy food or eat something that's tasty, eating something that's tasty will likely provide a more intense pleasure than eating healthy, even though healthy might bring more pleasure in the long run. Next, how long does it last? Watching a movie versus eating candy provides different lengths of pleasure. Watching the movie will give you several hours of pleasure, while eating candy will probably only give you a few minutes. So watching a movie has a longer duration of happiness. The next question is, how long until the happiness starts? So for example, let's say you're trying to decide between doing some homework or watching a movie. It'll take you several days or weeks to get the benefit of doing the homework, doing well on a test, or being able to apply that knowledge. On the other hand, you can watch a movie very quickly, probably within a few minutes. So in that way, watching a movie has less remote happiness, meaning it's sooner and therefore it's better utility. Fourth, how likely is the choice to lead to pleasure? So, for example, if you won the lottery, that would bring you a lot of pleasure. Buying toothpaste, on the other hand, will bring you only a small amount of pleasure. On the other hand, it's not very likely that you're going to win the lottery, whereas the pleasure that you'll derive from having toothpaste is pretty likely. So even though the toothpaste is a much less intense happiness, it's much more certain. That would make it better utility in this sense. Are there other benefits? If you're trying to decide between working out or watching a movie, whichever one has the better intensity, in the long run, working out will likely have other benefits. For example, feeling healthier later on, whereas watching a movie is less likely to have benefits later on. Are there any negative side effects? Imagine you're trying to decide whether or not to do recreational drugs or eat healthy food. Even though the drugs might provide a more intense happiness, they will also have a negative side effects. You'll be hungover, or you'll have to spend more money, or there might be legal implications. So even though eating healthy might not be as intense a happiness, it doesn't have the same negative side effects. Last, how many people's happiness is affected? For example, if you're deciding whether to watch a movie or to plant a garden in your yard, if you watch a movie, that pretty much only affects your happiness. On the other hand, if you plant a garden, that'll bring happiness to people who walk by and enjoy it. So in that sense, even though you would get more happiness from watching a movie, overall there would be a greater utility from planting a garden. These are 7 aspects of utility that need to be considered when dealing with a utilitarian case study. The first utilitarian case study we'll look at is the decision between eating a slice of your favorite cake or watching a new episode of your favorite TV show, whatever that happens to be. So the first question is, how intense is the pleasure? Well, in general, eating your favorite dessert will probably be more intense a pleasure than watching a TV show. On the other hand, the TV show is likely to last longer than your favorite dessert. Your favorite dessert might only last a few minutes, where your favorite TV show might be half an hour or an hour, maybe even longer. How likely is the happiness to happen at all? Well, your favorite dessert is probably a lot more likely to bring you happiness than your favorite TV show, because even the best TV shows occasionally have an off episode. So there's always a chance that it won't bring you as much happiness. On the other hand, it's probably a lot easier to see your favorite TV show than it is to get your favorite dessert. Your favorite dessert, you might have to go shopping. You might have to make it yourself. You might have to have one of your family members make it for you. So in that sense, watching a new episode of your favorite TV show is probably a little bit happier in this dimension. On the other hand, when you eat the cake, there's not really a lot of long-term benefit other. Whereas if you watch your favorite TV show, then you can talk about it to other people. You can think about how it inspires your fan fiction. So the new episode of your TV show probably brings you more utility in this sense. Negative side effects. So eating your favorite dessert is probably going to bring more negative side effects. For example, you might feel sluggish, you might sugar crash, whereas on the other hand, watching the TV show doesn't tend to have a lot of negative consequences. So, since the TV show has fewer negative consequences, it will bring you more utility in this dimension. Finally, let's look at how many people's happiness is affected by it. If you eat your favorite dessert, that might bring some happiness to the baker that you buy it from. Whereas, if you watch a new episode of your TV show, this could bring pleasure to your friends, your coworkers or housemates, or anyone who you get to talk to about it. If you look at these two groups, there are many more people who gain happiness from your watching the new episode of TV show. Keep in mind, this isn't meant to be a very profound example, but just in general, there are more people affected if you share your enjoyment of the TV show than if you have your dessert. So, in summary, since you get more happiness and more people gain utility from you watching a new episode of your TV show, then, according to an ACT Utilitarian case study, the choice that'll bring the most utility is watching the TV show, so that is the morally correct choice. The analysis for our second scenario will be a little bit different. This time, we're going to apply rule utilitarianism instead of act utilitarianism. For the first scenario, we used act utilitarianism, where the question is, which action will lead to the greatest utility? Rule utilitarianism is slightly different. It's still utilitarian in that the morally correct decision is whichever leads to the greatest overall utility. What's different is, instead of evaluating a specific act, instead, what we'll do is we'll figure out which rules we can apply in this situation and then determine which of the rules will lead to the greatest utility. In other words, which rule will lead to the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. For this scenario, the decision you're faced with is whether to study first and then go drinking with your friends, or to go drinking with your friends and then study tonight. In other words, study or drink beer. Our first step is to figure out which rules we can apply to the situation. A first possibility would be to always drink beer with friends. Another possible rule would be studying is for fools. So in other words, just avoid studying. A third possibility would be beer first, then study later. Those three possible rules are all on the side of drinking the beer first. On the other hand, there are also rules which are pro-studying. One possibility would be to always study, no matter what. Another rule would be never drink beer, no matter what. A third possible rule would be to study first, then have beer. Since what we're trying to do is figure out which rule will lead to the greatest happiness, on either side of the issue, pro-beer or pro-studying, let's go with whichever rule is most likely to lead to the greatest happiness. On the pro-beer side, it's probably beer first, study later, since the other two rules are very extreme and are not likely to lead to happiness. And on the pro-studying side is study first, then beer, because the other two choices are less likely to lead to happiness. Just like in the first scenario, we're going to apply the 7 aspects of utility to figure out which of these two rules will lead to the greatest happiness. First up, drinking beer first, then studying later is more intense of a pleasure. That'll bring a more intense happiness. On the other hand, studying brings a longer lasting happiness because you get to enjoy the benefits when you write tests, when you complete assignments, and when you use that knowledge later in life. The beer that you might have drank that night probably won't bring you much happiness a few days later. On the other hand, sometimes studying can be frustrating and it doesn't always lead to direct benefit, whereas drinking a beer is a pretty surefire way to enjoy yourself, assuming you like beer. Also, getting to beer is probably much more quick than it would be to get started with studying. With studying, to get the happiness, you have to get yourself set up, you have to arrange all your material, and then to get the happiness part of it, you actually have to accomplish something, like doing well on a test or handing in an assignment. So beer has greater utility in this dimension. On the other hand, studying first and then having the beer is more likely to have other benefits. If you study, you might get a better job. If you study first then have the beer, you get the benefit of studying and you get to socialize a bit, which means that later on you'll have strong relationships while still developing yourself professionally. On the other hand, if you have the beer first and study later, drinking beer now doesn't really lead to many more opportunities later. It also probably doesn't lead to great studying later on. Studying first also wins in the category of negative side effects. If you study first, then have the beer, there's not any likely negative side effects besides maybe missing out on some of the social fun that you would otherwise have if you drank first. On the other hand, if you have beer first and then try and study later, it's possible there will be some negative side effects like a hangover or not getting to your studying or spending more money than you intended. Last, let's look at the other people whose happiness is affected by your making this choice. If you decide to drink the beer first and then study later, the people who will derive happiness from this are your friends who you'd socialize with, the bartender that you'd tip, and the establishment that you buy your drinks from. If instead you study first and then only drink beer after, the people who benefit from this, who derive happiness from this, are your family, your future clients, future employers, your classmates, because then you can help other people with their homework. Now, because there's potentially infinite number of people who are affected by your choices, let's focus on the ones who are most affected from these groups. So the person or type of person who derives the most utility from your having your beer first are probably your friends. They would be more significantly impacted than the bartender or the establishment. If you study first, that's probably going to bring the most happiness to your family, maybe your parents, maybe your siblings, but these are the people who will actually notice if you study. Since we're doing a rule utilitarian calculus, what we have to consider is, if you follow this rule consistently, who will derive the most happiness from it? For yourself, you have 3 check marks on the left and 3 check marks on the right, so that looks like a tie. In terms of the other people affected though, if, as a rule, you always study first, it's more likely that your family's happiness will last longer and be more intense than your friends. Your friends might not always show up, so you're following the rule of drinking beer first and then studying won't bring them any happiness at all. So, in conclusion, according to rule utilitarianism, the morally correct choice is to follow the rule where you study first, then have beer after. That's what leads to the greatest happiness. To summarize the procedure for these utilitarian case studies, first, identify two competing rules which cover the situation and are most likely to have the highest utility. This applies to rule utilitarianism and not act utilitarianism, but since in life most of the decisions you make apply to a broad range of decisions, this is probably where you should start. For both act and rule utilitarianism, next use the 7 questions, also known as the felicific calculus, to determine which option leads to the greatest utility. Then draw a conclusion. The greatest utility is the morally correct choice. Thank you for watching.